So far, our conception of the evolutionary development was a neat layer by layer vertical ascent. Levels of consciousness emerging, reshaping the individual form and building as if a higher and higher gradation. There comes a point though, as we open to the ranges above the mind, that we discover each of these layers was more free, more wide, more flexible, but crossing the threshold of the mind into the higher ranges, it's not just wider and more flexible, it actually opens out to something which is infinite. But from that infinity, when you look down, you discover that what you were conscious of below was also infinite, but its infinity was hidden. You discover that behind the surface working of the mind was a deeper inner working of a mind which was also opening to infinity. Behind the life energies of the individuality and the little petty desire surface personality, there was an infinity of life energy. And even behind the narrow little physical body, which is so rigid, so dull, so heavy, there is behind it a kind of a subtler physical body, which is open to infinity. And so, looking down from this now slightly higher poise, we begin to explore these and discover what's hidden behind the appearance. And we get now a more complex picture. This little neat ascension of layers was forming the surface person, the center of which was this false person, false individuality that we call ego, which is primarily a bundle of desires and habits bound in a bit of a knot, which is all the time shifting, moving around, drifting, nothing stable, nothing fixed, changing. But behind that, there is this whole range of gradations supporting and, so to say, feeding influences into this surface narrow individuality. And in that is a rich and complex world, which we will now explore a little bit. That rich and complex world is largely unknown to this little narrow surface personality because it is so fixated on the physical body and the physical senses that it rarely stops to disengage, turn back and explore these ranges. First of all, we discover that the life energy which was shaping the physical body and physical matter has an independent reality of its own. It's not just life force in the body working, but life force standing back from the body and having its own separate life, of which we are not conscious. So let me start with a simple example. You took the seed and put it in the soil. You watered it. And if you've done this at home, you sprout grains. Let's say you've sprouted a bean or a wheat. Within a few days, the sprout has grown so thick and so large, the shell of the grain has been dropped, it has just been broken and shed, and the insides has been completely replaced by the sprout. What in the new sprouted grain is common with the original grain? Nothing at all. You can say it's the same matter, but the way it has restructured itself, it's no more the same. In fact, they say sprouted grains are good for you because they have many more vitamins, many more minerals, much more nutritious. It was not the grain, it has become something else already. And it continues. And the question to be asked is, what's common between them? And if there is nothing common, how can this become that? Physically, you do not find anything in common. What is held in common is non-physical. It's a bundle of life energy, and I'm going to coin a new term, life energy grain, life energy seed. or life energy bundle, which is common to the grain and common to this new thing and common to all the rest that follows into the plant. And what is that? What does it contain? Because it has within it enough knowledge, enough force and enough identity of life energy to take it all the way through full tree hood, which is millions of times larger than the grain. And so different that you have nothing in common. In fact, the tree hood is going to shed 1,000 grains, each of which will be a replica of this one, pretty much. So what is it that can stay attached to a grain and yet grow to become this big and then burst out copies of itself and still not change? Because it has to be something in common. And you realize it cannot be physical. I'll give you another very interesting example. You know the transformation that a caterpillar goes through. You have a caterpillar and then you have a butterfly. And that's transformation. There's nothing in common between the two. And how does the transition take place? The caterpillar eats leaves, lots of leaves, grows really fat, so much that he has an excess of material, and then uses some of that to weave this silken cocoon around itself and locks itself into a cocoon. And once it is safe within the cocoon, again very similar to the concept of a seed, it secretes a protein which begins to decompose, break down its own bodies and cells, until it breaks down so completely that it becomes pure liquid. There's nothing of the physical biological structure of the caterpillar left, nothing at all, not even the bone structure. And then once it is completely liquefied, it begins to reorganize itself and a new cellular structure begins to form, which becomes very neatly, cleverly folded butterfly with its wings folded and with a unique pattern within. And then at some point when it has sufficiently solidified as a new body, it suddenly becomes half awake, full awake, and begins to cut a hole through, drags itself out, and then opens its wings and flies away. If you observe that transition point where it is pure liquid, and the before and after, there's nothing connecting it. In fact, if the liquefaction is not complete, you will not have butterfly. And what is interesting, and this is the part I'm coming to, if at the point where it is completely liquid, you cut open a tiny hole, a slit, take a stick and stir the liquid and seal it back, you will still get the perfect butterfly. What in that liquefied state held the knowledge of how to become a butterfly? And if there was something which had that capacity from that liquefied mixed liquid to become butterfly, what if it was common to the original caterpillar? It had to be there, something in common, isn't it? Obviously it is not physical. And so we come to the conclusion that there is another body, and we will call it the life energy body, the vital body. And in that vital body is not only the life force, but even a mind form of what the butterfly should become, the template, the idea of butterfly. And if you have stirred the liquid, then there is nothing in that idea which has been affected. So the idea is so free from the physicality and yet able to influence the physicality so deeply that it can make a complete shape out of it. And if this is true of the seed, if it is true of the caterpillar and butterfly, it's equally true of us. We don't undergo such a dramatic change, and yet, well, look at your body and what it was when you were newborn, little baby would be about this much. What maintained the continuity? What in it had all the knowledge to be able to build itself? You see, in the first 2 years, the baby grows in weight double, triple even eventually. And everything is replaced. All the cells are replaced. Even functionally, it undergoes changes. In the first 6 months, it cannot eat solid foods. And later, it develops that capacity. The brain is so small that even the formed mind of the adult is unable to function in that kind of an undeveloped brain. And yet, the continuity of consciousness is retained. Sometimes even, there are children who remember what it was like when they were born. What in the brain or consciousness held that memory? So these questions, these introspections lead us to the recognition that there's something, we are not this, we are something much more, and that's more truly us than this body. The caterpillar and the butterfly are more truly the vital mental body seed form than the physicality of both either caterpillar or butterfly. So when you start exploring yourself and you say, well, what am I really? That it is not this body, and then you begin to now disengage from this body and identify with that part of you, you are much more truly you than you ever were before. And so here we have in the yoga tradition the vocabulary of sheath. The physical body is described as annamaya kosha. Anna is matter, it is also food. Annamaya of the nature of matter or formed of matter. Kosha is sheath. A sheath is a covering. So we don't use the word body. Body I don't think has an equivalent, at least in this context. The sheath is something which covers something else or encloses or provides a surface protective layer for its identity. So this is your physical body sheath. And then there is the pranamaya of the prana, of the life force sheath. And then there is the manomaya, which is of the mind, of the character of mind or substance of mind sheath. For whom? And these three sheaths are the means by which this real person is able to engage with matter and the physical world. But the sheath itself is already a layer, a body, which exists independently. The manomaya and pranamaya, the mental sheath and the vital sheath, and let's now use the word body, independently exist from the physical body sheath and have a life of their own. So a little bit of this we experience every night when we go to sleep, when momentarily a part of the mental and vital body slowly separate from the physical body and kind of drift apart. And that initial movement as you go to sleep, often there's a sense of floating. And if at that moment you're awake, you feel you're slipping and you jerk awake, and there's a sense of falling and awakening with a shock. And it was because the subtle sheaths were separating partially. And if by then you have not fallen asleep, at the moment of separation, one tends to drift into sleep. If you have not fully fallen asleep and your mind kicks in and says, what's happening? The jerk brings it back, makes it fall with a shock. But if you have fallen asleep, then what happens? The physical body is what goes to sleep. That's the you that thinks it has gone to sleep. And then there is the you, much more you, which is in the subtle body, which has not gone to sleep. And in it, things start happening. Three kinds of things. First is the normal thought, emotion patterns, habits tend to rise, but now without the dullness that the physical body brings into it. So if you have in the day, let's say, had certain fears or certain intense emotions, and those arise, you can experience them in the vital body much more intensely than in the physical body. The physical body is what dulls everything. But in the vital body, there's this intensity of emotion that you feel, sometimes so intense, so overwhelming that you may wake up from it. I don't know if you've ever had, almost everybody has had a dream where somebody was there, somebody has died or something, and you're so intensely sad that you wake up. Or you're so intensely happy or so intensely excited that you wake up. And if you remember the point of transition of waking up, You remember the intensity and then it begins to dull as you wake up and get back to your physical body. So you notice the vital body has a very different way of sensing and knowing and experiencing the world in its terms. It has its own senses also. And unlike the physical senses, which are biologically bound to the sockets of the eyes, you look through from here, you can't look on the side, you can't look behind. In the vital body, your sight is a 360-degree awareness of your environment. Very interesting. And that's why in the dream, you don't have any clear sense of turning attention. You're aware of everything. But also in the mental body, which is attached to the vital or part of it which is floating off, has equally awareness in awareness of thought. And so often in dream, you have this sense that you met somebody and you don't remember any words spoken, but you knew why they were there and what you wanted to say, and they knew what you wanted to say, and whole exchange takes place instantaneously. And so when you narrate the dream, I met such and such a person and I didn't say it, but we knew this and we knew that and something happened. You don't remember the words being spoken because you don't need words. It's only in the physical body that you have to move your lips to make a sound for the other person to hear and then translate into thought and emotion. In the subtle body, the vital or mental body, you directly experience the emotions of others and the thoughts of others, and there is an instantaneous, and I will even use the word complete, transmission. The problem of miscommunication does not take place. In fact, the vital body, because it is not as rigid as the physical, is also more fluid, more large. And being fluid, when you meet somebody, there is instantly an identification in some part of the vital body, vital energy, an exchange of energy that takes place. Because it's a world of energy, not a form. And at that moment, you feel what the other person feels as if it is your own experience. Perfect transmission. If it's a thought, you experience the thought of the other person's thought as if it's your own thought. And you understand exactly what they are about. And your response is instantly reflected in his consciousness equally. The result is, if you communicate on those levels, you rarely can have misunderstanding, but in a single touch, you can communicate much more than hundreds or thousands of words. Now imagine a situation where two of us meet and one of us has to narrate a whole set of incidents or ideas or some situational issue. Both of us briefly disengage from the physical body. We briefly touch and instantly we know exactly what it's about. Wouldn't that be interesting? What if we do not have to fully disengage from the physical body because we are now conscious of the subtle bodies and we connect and then a single word is spoken or a phrase, it was good. I come back from an experience, I'm reporting to you and I say, it was good. And poof, in that good, the full experience of all that I've had is instantly in identity transmitted and you know exactly what I have experienced and what I'm talking about. Isn't that great? A single word carrying an entire chapter, not even a paragraph of experience. And this is well within our capacity, as we are, except we have never developed those dimensions of awareness, which are latent, hidden. And as the consciousness begins to free itself from the narrowness of the individuality, these dimensions come into our awareness more and more and grow into. We grow into this deeper, richer, wider experience of the world. If this is the case between human beings, how is it when you meet a flower? So let's say you are aware in your vital and mental body. Perhaps even let's make the situation even more interesting. Aware of the deeper center of the three sheaths, which is the soul, the psychic being. And let's say you're aware, if not living in it, but just aware of its influence, of its presence. And now you approach the flower. What do you experience? Well, with your physical eyes, you're looking at the particular form and color and maybe smelling its perfume. But in your vital body, you meet and experience the contact with the vital body of the flower. In your mental body, you're aware of the idea of flower and the consciousness of flower and the full rich experience of the flower's journey to whatever extent it contains it. And deep within, in that part which resonates with the soul's presence, you experience the psychic presence of the flower as precisely, as intimately, or more intimately even, than you could see its physical form with your physical sight. And then you can even describe what the flower expresses, what the flower experiences, what it gives. Those of you who are familiar with this idea will immediately recognize how the mother named the flowers by their psychological and spiritual content. That each flower, whatever its physical form and shape, is in fact, in essence, a psychic consciousness, a soul consciousness turned towards expression in form of flower, with a unique quality or a unique psycho-spiritual vibration or purpose of what it represents or expresses. Just as each one of us has a unique line of development of our consciousness, well, each flower species has something distinctive. And she named the flowers accordingly. Those of you who were with Narad this morning for the morning walk will perhaps now remember the names which he will have mentioned of each of the flowers, the psycho-spiritual names. But what you notice which is fascinating is that the form of the flower often is a representation of the quality of consciousness that it embodies. And this is what is fascinating, even down to the level of the structure of the flower. Color. The colors represent psychological qualities. And then the structure and the function of the flower represents psychological qualities. And here's the interesting part. If you eat the flower or take the extract of the flower physically, you have a result which corresponds to the psychological qualities. And just to prove how this works and how objective this can be, you may have heard of something called Bach's flower remedies. And this is something which was developed in Europe by somebody by the name of Bach, who discovered that certain flowers have certain curative properties. And there is one particular which he has suggested for curing fears. Independent of that, when the mother looked at the flowers which were given to her and named them, and she named about 900 flowers. She took pains to name 900 because there was something very important there to which it was worth giving so much attention. Well, the flower which corresponds to Bach's remedy, she has named courage. Bach independently finds this flower helpful for overcoming fears. Interesting. And so these psychological, spiritual, soul qualities of the flower are something which are extremely effective physically, even in their medicinal result. But they have equally psychological results. When you breathe or when you're in the atmosphere of the flower, it radiates that particular vibration in the environment. And if you recognize that the vital body and the mental body are not so rigidly bound to the form, there is an expansion of that influence in the environment, like a perfume. In fact, the physical spread of the perfume is only a physical representation of the vital influence spreading into the environment. Interesting. And now when you look at the flower from a distance, you already begin to feel its influence because you are sensitive on that level. If you've ever had this experience, somebody walks into the room, you briefly look at them and you already know, this fellow's angry, I'm going to have a hard time. You ever had that? Or the person walks into the room and suddenly the whole atmosphere changes. You have perhaps not even fully looked at them, but the impact of their presence has hit you at a distance and shaped and changed things. Why? Because of that vital expanse of consciousness, which is well beyond the range of the physical body. I remember once, it was at a time when I was particularly sensitive. I was working in one of the departments of the ashram, and suddenly I feel a particular vibration, and then in my mind the association of that vibration comes up. Oh, it is such and such a person whom I have not met maybe in 5 years. And there she walks in after a few seconds. At the time when I felt it, she was behind the wall. And the aura obviously penetrates through the wall, your vital expansion. I'm using the word general term. In the theosophical tradition, they call it the aura. It includes the vital, mental, and maybe even other influences that had already crossed through and come into that space, and a contact was made. If I was not conscious, I would not have known, or perhaps it would have reflected in my thought as a memory of a time meeting that person, and then she walks in, and I'll say, oh, I was just thinking about you. Has that happened to you? You're thinking about somebody and the telephone rings, or they walk in. It's actually not that you were thinking about her. You felt the contact of the presence of consciousness in your subtle body, which evoked in your surface narrow individuality the memory or the association. You began to think as a result of the contact, and then the physical contact followed. Now, when you recognize what's really happening behind the scenes, and when you begin to observe and analyze, you discover what a fascinating world it is. The mother explains how not only the vital body can expand, or its influence can expand a much larger space, the mental body is even more plastic. And she says all you need to do is think about a person, and already a part of your mind is reaching out and in contact. Interesting. But it's out there. Let's say the person is on the other side of the world. You think about them, you've made a contact. But where? Is it a part of you stretching out and traveling now, 10,000 miles to make a contact? No, that's not how it works. It's not the physical world, remember, it's not physicality. In the physical world, you have hard, rigid form and separation and distance. The moment you move into the vital world, in the vital body, already the form does not have this rigidity and binding. Everything is in terms of energy fields, energy qualities. And so when I remember somebody affectionately, it is the affection which brings the person close in contact. And so there is no physical sense of distance. Things are not in terms of form and distance of form. They are in terms of affinity of energy, familiarity of energy. So I remember when I remember my grandmother, let's say with affection, as if a part of my energy turns and instantly there is a contact, because the vital world is domain of energy, not of form, and so the affinity is what makes you close or far. If you've ever sat next to a person you don't like, or you don't have much in common with, you may be physically next to each other, but in consciousness you're far away. And that's how it is experienced in the vital. Somebody with whom you have no affinity, no alignment is far. Something with whom you have affinity and alignment is close. That's all there is to it. And if this is the nature of the vital world, the mental world is even more flexible and fluid. There it is alignment of idea. The very thought of a person is enough to make the contact instantaneously. And that's why in the dream state, you have these strange descriptions where you say, I was in such and such a place, and then I turned, and then I was in somebody else's house. It doesn't matter where you are physically. It is the affinity of consciousness, of emotion, which makes you close. But this has massive implications. When you do a Skype call, let's say I now do a Skype call with my grandmother who's on the other side of the world, there's a physical picture, which is nothing but electrical light signals on the screen, being translated to electrical light signals on the other side, and there's just exchange of electricity in between. Not even electricity, it's converted into electromagnetic waves bounced off a couple of satellites. There's nothing physically linking it. And yet, as I begin to relate to her, talking to her, suddenly I feel emotionally connected as intensely as if she is right here in the room. I feel her presence physically. And after I have said bye and I have disconnected the call, for a while that presence is still there and only gradually fades out. And as I am feeling this, she is feeling the same on the other side. And it's not that we have created two separate images in our space. We are actually meeting each other. I am meeting her, my vital energy is meeting her vital energy right now. There is no representation like in the physical screen. The representation is needed only for your physical body and physical senses to help tune in your emotional and vital consciousness to make the connection. Now you see the implications of this. You could knock out the physical component and directly connect. Simply remembering her. I was sitting remembering her and suddenly I felt so close. And maybe later I get a phone call and she says, you know what, I was feeling you so strongly I needed to call. It's as simple as that. And this is happening all the time. Not only that, it gets even more interesting. Let's say tomorrow you have a meeting with somebody. And let's say it is a meeting which has created within you a little bit of tension or expectation. You're going to meet your boss and make a presentation upon which your career might hinge. And so in your mind there is already this thinking dwelling upon that connection and the meeting. And all the anxiety which you have is, a large part is in the physical body tension, but its source is in the vital body. But you're thinking on some level of your boss. And in that thinking, feeling, a connection has already been made as if your boss is next to you. Now imagine what's really happening there. You're meeting your boss right now while you're anxious and throwing this anxious energy towards him. He physically may be busy in his work, but in his vital body he senses the anxiety. If he's conscious, he will even know this guy is really anxious. But if he's not conscious, he still receives the impact of that anxiety. Long before we have met, long before we have had a physical interaction, there has already been an exchange of energy and maybe even a setup of alignment of energetic tension. So that when I walk into the room and I'm about to meet him, already a relationship of anxiety has been defined and in place. If he's strong enough, if he's a good boss, he will sense this and project a positive energy. And with a smile disarm, with a few words disarm and make you feel comfortable and dissolve that tension. And that's what makes for a good boss. You're somehow able to play at the level of energies without always being fully conscious of what you're doing. But when you're conscious of it, you recognize that there's a continuous series of links or energetic flows that's taking place all around with people we don't even know of sometimes. Because there is an affinity of energy which makes us close without ever meeting physically. You see the implications of this. We're actually in conversation or energetic exchange with people of similar affinities. And that's already acting upon us. If you've ever been or let's take an example of the email. You remember the person intensely and poof, the email comes. And the email, at the time when you open it, discharges the full impact of the energy. I've had this a couple of times when there was a sense of a tension regarding something I couldn't make out what. The email comes and I open it and here's something pretty nasty. And the energy of it was already touching, but now the opening the email discharges the energy into my physical surface personality. But already things had been set up. And if you're ever in a email exchange group or chat group where there may be a few hundred people, there is actually an energetic link which is formed across all these 100 people. You may not know them by name at all. But entering the chat room, you have plugged into that energy and you're part of that community energetically. And it doesn't matter where you are physically on the earth. So the internet has actually opened to us a physical means through which we can experience this much more directly externally. But what is already happening on an inner level has got represented physically. There's already an inner net, not internet. The inner net of vital connections which are already there, even mental connections. And more deeply, even at an essential level, soul connections. All of these make for a universe which is at least a dozen times more complex and more complete than the physical little world in which we live. Sri Aurobindo points out that on these levels often so much happens which determines the outcome in the physical space. And I'm going to give you just one example. Let's say we go back to the example of the boss whom you're going to meet. On that inner level, the night before the physical meeting, there's already been contact, there's already been an exchange, and certain things have been set rolling. The decisions are already made, which the boss is not conscious on the surface part, which you are not conscious on your surface part. When you meet, what you experience is an unfoldment of what was already determined there. If we can become conscious of what happens there, if we can begin to intervene on that level, we can actually influence outcomes ahead of time. We can even recognize and set this pattern in place, and then you say, I don't care what happens, it's going to happen physically, eventually, because on an energetic level, it's already done. And so you find these very unusual statements. For example, from Sri Aurobindo in 1934, one of the disciples comes to him, and that was a time when India was under colonial rule. Many of the disciples were freedom fighters, and one of them says, I'm always bothered by this whole situation, and I cannot concentrate on my spiritual purpose without some conviction of that freedom ever being acquired. And then Sri Aurobindo makes a statement, and he says something so decisive. He says, as certainly as the sun will rise tomorrow, India is going to be free. Because it's already done there. And then he writes in a different letter, he says, I'm more concerned with what India will do with her freedom. And he's looking ahead, and he writes, Bolshevism or Gunda Raj, things look ominous. And as you know, India actually went perilously close to a communist framework, and then a kind of a compromise was made in a socialistic framework, which had all the problems which come with it. And Gunda Raj is the rule of the thugs, which was equally prevalent in that whole thing for many decades after freedom. It's only now beginning to change, really. But he foresaw this. How? Where? Where is it happening? On these domains of the vital and the mental, and even above into the spiritual realms. Initiating an action on those levels, you can be sure if it is accomplished there, it will ripple out into the physical domain for sure. If it is still uncertain there, well, all the way down to the most physical result, it could still modify and slip somewhere. The higher the source of the action, the more compelling the outcome, because the greater power it has. And so there's this amazing incident in 1920. You see, India became free in 1947. The statement Sri Aurobindo made was in 1934 or something. But 1920 is this recorded incident where Sri Aurobindo and the mother were working from the spiritual domains to act for India's freedom. And they are working, meaning they are working with the spiritual energies, releasing, modifying the trends of forces, overcoming, redirecting forces. Literally, if there was a physical flow of water and you channel the water, modify, redirect to get a particular pattern of outcome. It's something like that. In the vital worlds, it is energy flows. In the mental worlds, it is idea forms. In the spiritual domain, it is spiritual consciousness, but as seed idea. And if that can be formed and projected with full effectivity through the mind and vital, the outcome is certain, often with precision. If it is not fully formed in the mental vital worlds, the outcome is certain, but with variations of form. And so 1920, they achieved it. And then suddenly Mother said, India is free. It's done. And Sri Aurobindo asks, how did it happen? Was there much bloodshed? That was the concern they had, because they were navigating, so to say, the destiny of the field spiritually. And Mother said, no, they went as they came because of the change in the world situation. That's it. Now this is held at an essential level. If you recognize what that means, they went as they came, it's already done there. And then it's a question of working out. Literally that projection will find human instruments aligned to it. Remember, in the vital world, you have affinity based on energetic alignments. In the mental world, in thought alignments. So projecting from above, literally it will gather around itself the right people, form with the right ideas, fill them with the right energies, and shape the outcome all the way down to the most material result. I'm giving you I can only describe it as a glimpse of this inner and larger domain, all the way top down, from the spirit down to the material, which begins to open to you as this consciousness widens out. And you realize that you are only a part, a tiny part of a large universal energy, a domain of universal thought. And even materially, your body is connected somehow, materially, at a subtle inner level with the universal circumstances. And the trends of those large movements often will determine, and with which you can predict the outcome even of the future, or modify them even. This is a first glimpse of this larger and inner field that one begins to now engage with. But along with it are other interesting things which also come, and this is the second half of the discussion here. Tomorrow I will be elaborating on some other things associated with it, but the second side is, when you become conscious in your vital consciousness, in your vital body, you realize your physical body and your vital body are intimately connected, and equally every object has its own equivalent vital body. And one of the implications is your vital body meeting another vital body can modify things in it. This becomes the basis for a whole realm of exploration that we call energy-based healing. When with pranic healing or Reiki or many other names, a person comes to you, projects an energy and intervenes to actually accelerate healing. The form of it sometimes can be so vague that you don't even know something has happened. A person sits next to you, speaks a few kind words and goes away. And if he was conscious, he has already intervened and initiated or even completed the healing. And you wouldn't even know that he was responsible. But otherwise, generally it takes a more dramatic form where the person raises their hands, places their hands, touches, or whatever the forms you have seen. Sometimes they'll put little crystals and all kinds of gimmicks which only help to channel or focus your attention or the energy flow, none of which are actually needed. I'm going to share with you a few examples of this which I recently came across. And this was done in a laboratory in India, which is one of the premier laboratories of a pharmaceutical company with all the US FDA approved facilities. That is, they have the competence to do every possible experiment in the test tube, in lab rats and in human beings, clinical trials of pharmaceutical drugs to validate them. And they have the authorization, and if they do it, it's accepted by the US FDA. That's a very high level of acceptability and competence. They were approached by a group of healers who said, we want to validate what we have been doing objectively. And they said, well, we will apply the most rigorous scientific trials with double blind and other verifications. They said, no problem. And so over a span of about 2 years, they did a series of experiments with nearly 100 people. And some of them flew to Delhi, went to the labs, and these were double-blind trials. That means even the scientists would not know which sample had been healed, which had not. which had an energetic intervention and which had not. They were just labeled, and later, afterwards, you would match them to see what the outcome was. And the responses from the scientists were quite interesting also. So I'll give a few examples here. So they would take a cellular culture and apply to it a healing. The way it works was they had a nutritional liquid into which the cellular culture is placed. So there'll be 2 bowls of nutritional liquid. One of the bowls would be given the healing energy, the other not. And then they would put the cell culture in both and then see what happens over a few days or weeks. The healers were targeted specific things. So there were about 24 parameters on which they had to act. These included certain amino acids, certain hormonal levels, certain growth structures. So in one particular case, when there is an inflammation, there is a marker for inflammation which rises dramatically. And they were told, we want this marker, and a technical name is given, we want this marker to be reduced. In another case, they wanted the same marker to be increased because it represented increased boosted vitality. In each case, when they asked for a specific marker to be raised or reduced, the healing done, the marker shot up 60% typically or went down 60%. And this is huge. It's not a 5 or 10% variation, a 60% variation, and with all the double-blind tests. So when the first results came, the chief scientist looks at all this and says, how do we accept this? Let's do it again. And they went through the whole process all over again. And remember, this is many samples which have been used each time. They went through all over again, exactly the same results. And then they began to see how the same marker for inflammation could be brought down in one case, and another case could be shot up when they needed it. Now ask yourself, what does the healer know about the cellular working or the inflammation markers inside the cells? He doesn't even know what you're talking about. You just give him a term. We want oxytocin level to go up. What does that mean even? So the healers would often say, well, what is it exactly? Tell me what that thing does. And so he's explained that this is what this particular amino acid or substance acts in the cell. The healer says, okay. And then he concentrates and punches a burst of energy into the sample. But with the idea that this should happen. I'm giving this example because the implications are so extraordinary. The healer doesn't know the cells. He doesn't know how the cells work. He has no way of knowing where that particular molecule exists in the cells. You want to push up a protein, you want to reduce the cellular function. You don't know anything about it. You've never seen a picture. You cannot see the cells. All you've done is punched energy with an intention. This energy now seeps into the cells, and inside the cells begins to operate to work out that intention. And that intention, of course, had no idea of what this particular substance means or where it is. But the energy is able to find that substance and modify it, boost it or reduce it or modify the functioning of the cells to get it to boost or reduce. Can you recognize that the energy working has greater intelligence and specific knowledge of the cells than you had as a healer? See, the implications of this are so great. You put a mental intention that said, I want this biomarker to go up. The energy going inside the cells has to know the full working of the cells and intervene in a way that will eventually lead to that biomarker going up. You see the implication of this, that inside the energy is working was a greater intelligence than even yours, or specific knowledge than even yours. Now the implication of this is so great. It means you could put out a general intention out there, and the intention will develop through its energetic action all the details of how to make itself effective without you ever knowing details of the circumstances. And this is what we are seeing happening in these examples, in these tests. And in one of the cases, and this is so shocking, so first I'm identifying the kind of precision which can be acquired in a general intervention. The second example is of the rapidity of change. So here were neural cells, neurons from the brain of rats, in which the goal, the intention was to boost the connections between the neurons. You see, between two cells of the neurons, there can be up to 100 connections even. And you just want to boost the number of connections. Now this is actually relating to intelligence, by the way. When you study and learn new things, the cells themselves do not change, but their interconnections grow and change. And of course, if you're learning a lot, then even new cells are created to fill in for the insufficiency of the connections. And when you don't learn, when you don't do something, these connections tend to break down and even the cells begin to die eventually. So here's a sample into which an intention has been placed for the nerve cells to grow. Now comes the next step in the lab. The energy has been put in one sample and not in another. It goes to the next level in the lab. The scientists put cells inside and watch through the microscope. And what was astounding was within 1 to 2 minutes, they could see the nerve cells growing out connections and joining connections. Within 1 or 2 minutes. Again, the implications are staggering. Remember, these connections relate directly to increased intelligence. If right now in your brain or the rest of your nervous system, you were to punch this life force with that intention for them to grow more connections, within 2 minutes, the actual physical growth begins to be visually measured and stays. And the scientists were so surprised, they took it out of the sample. Remember, there's the energy base into which you put the cells. They took it out and the growth stopped. They put it back, it started again. Took it out, it stopped. Immediately. In other words, you can actually boost your physical intelligence, your brain intelligence capacity, just by willing it, intending it into the energy field of your brain or your nervous system. You know of patients who have had a damaged nervous system, because of which a part of the body becomes immovable, paralyzed. You have a break in a burst of a vessel in the brain and left side of the body is paralyzed. What do? You have to regenerate the nerve cells here. And how do you do that? Intention, and the process starts. Now it can be the intention of the person wanting to do it. It can be the intention of another person wanting to do it. Putting the energy into you. It will be equivalent. Very interesting. So you are busy thinking, oh, my left hand is not moving and I'm trying to force it to move. Putting energy into the arm, that's the wrong place. You need to put the energy there where the nerves are broken. Now remember, the intelligence in the working of the energy is more than what you have. And so without knowing specifics of where in the brain is the damage, you could punch a burst of energy with the intention that wherever there's the damage, the brain should regrow. And it will initiate the growth within 2 minutes. You see, the implications of this experiment are so great. And what it's showing you is the power which is latent within us, which we are totally unaware of, which we are not using consciously, or rather, and this is the more difficult thing to recognize, we are misusing unconsciously all the time. The moment you say, it's impossible, science says it is impossible. What have you just done? You've thrown a burst of energy. It should not, cannot happen. That's what you just did. When a patient opens to the doctor and says, doctor, can you help me? And doctor says, I'm sorry. It's one of those cases. We can do nothing. What did he just do? He put a burst of energy of denial and rejection of healing. But if the same doctor puts a positive energy and says, don't worry, you will be well. But he has to believe it. He has to put that intention into the energy. That's why doctors fail if they have been educated. Then they're bound in the education and the failure is designed in the very education. Whereas the mother of the child says, no, my child, you're going to get well because you have to get well. And God is there to help you. Well, whatever the faith she draws upon, she brings that extreme positive energy burst. And the result happens. Often in contradiction with the doctor who says it's impossible. The doctor may see a report that says, oh, she's improving so fast. How can that be? You've just put a negative energy with a negative intention. And so sometimes it is even helpful to isolate the person from these formations to be able to give them the positive shaping influence. And where you are makes a huge difference. And this comes to now something even more interesting, and we'll perhaps close with this or open to your questions after this. In the hospital is the ambience, the energy field, and the mind field of the belief system of the medical system. When you walk into the hospital, you're walking into their energy field and belief field. And you're shaped by it. Even your growth, recovery is defined, almost influenced by it. And this can go quite far. And an example is given of another test where patients are put in the general anesthetic, when technically, medically, you will say the person is unconscious. The doctors often make fun of the patient. They're operating, they're just having fun. Unfortunately, the culture in the operating theater is very low. But it goes all the way back to medical school, where they're making jokes about the patient and thinking the patient is unconscious. What does it matter? So they make crude comments of their biology or their illness. And the doctor says, this fellow is a bad case. We need to do something. It's going to take a long time to recover. He just said it. But at the inner level, it's all being registered. Almost like a post-hypnotic suggestion. Except it's not hypnotic. You're actually infusing that intention into the person. And so this was a series of experiments done where doctors were told to make negative comments. So a patient with a pretty normal case, where you normally heal within 2 or 3 days, the doctor was told to make comments like, this is going to take weeks to heal. And it so happened always. And the other cases where it normally was a complicated case which would take weeks, they were told to say, this will be great in a few days. No problem at all. And sending a positive intention, implanting it inside the patient, receiving it, they healed faster. The data is irrefutable. So you've entered the field and you are subject now to that field. Now imagine the reverse happening. You're taken into a space in which there is only the positivity. And this is where you have those miraculous cures. You've heard, what are the famous places? Lourdes, waters of Lourdes, for example, known for miraculous cures. And so you go to there, you dip into the water, and somebody who's been limping comes out completely cured. It doesn't happen to everybody though, but quite a few remarkable cases. What is it there? There's an ambient field of energy and idea of the well-being, of healing, into which you approach with your own intention and your ambient field and idea, with the faith that it will happen. And you enter into it, there's an alignment of the faiths, and the result takes place rapidly. If you go with a doubt, let's see if it works, maybe I can try it out, after all other things have failed, and you get partial cure. There's somebody, it was in the ashram, he had gone to some healer, he had an ear problem, and the healer said, I can cure you. And so he took mother's permission. Mother said, okay, go ahead. So he goes, that man pushes in sacred ash from his pujas into his ear until it presses really hard, and says, now you'll get cured. And the fellow comes back and he said he had a 90% cure. So he asked the mother, how is it that it wasn't complete? And mother said, because you still had that doubt that prevented it from being 100%. And so on the patient's receptive side, and on the other side, on the healer's side, the ambience and that particular alignment of thought and energy is so important. And this goes down not only in normal cases of medicine, but it goes on right now in your body. In the normal regeneration of the cells which is ongoing, all our bodies, according to the Ayurvedic tradition, which is now confirmed by modern science, every 7 years, all the cells are replaced. Each cell has a lifespan. So, the skin cells last a few days, and bone cells last a few months and sometimes years, but they are replaced by new cells. Now, if you have an injury and there's a scar mark, all the cells of the scar have been replaced every 7 years. So why does the scar remain? What holds the shape of the scar? And that's not in the physical body, it is in the vital and mental body. The memory of the injury, the conviction of the scarring needed is held there, and so the new cells are fitted into the scar structure. Or if you have an illness, functional illness, the new cells which could have overcome it are shaped to replicate and continue that functional deficiency. So I'll share with you a personal experience. When I was in kindergarten, must have been age 5 or so, they had this on the shorts, they had a metal buckle with sharp pins, and it had not been properly closed, and while walking it made a little cut on my left arm, and the scar remained. I grew from age 5 through all the years. The scar was distinct, clear, and late into my 30s, at which point I was going through some of these explorations, and I said, well, this should not be. Why is it repeating? It should not be. And something happened during that period when I consciously tried to get free of the memory of it. A couple of years down, one day I said, well, let me check, where is the scar? And I didn't remember which arm it was. So I checked both arms, the scar was gone. But I couldn't remember which arm it was. That's when it happened. When the memory, subliminal memory, in the inner part of the mind and vital, when that memory was erased, the physical body followed. As long as that memory remained, feeling the scar, feeling the injury, feeling the impact of that shock, and remembering it led to the sustenance of the scar. When that was erased, the scar was physically gone. Interesting. And I had another example where my finger had been cut. It was a sharp cut. It went pretty deep, almost half a centimeter in, and that's quite deep in the fingertip. I held the tissue together, and with a conscious intention to not accept the reality of the injury, but to hold the reality of the completeness of the fingertip. I held it for a few days, but it was sustained. It needed and sustained effort. At the end of those 2 days, at the end of the first 2 days, I could already feel something had changed. But I held that point down maybe a week, I think, I don't remember now. Then I could leave the finger, and there was a fine mark which also faded out, no scar left. Now I don't remember which finger it was. If I go by memory of how it was, because I was tearing off a tag from the luggage, I think it must have been the right finger. You see, I've forgotten which one it is, but there's nothing left. Down a couple of weeks, it was completely gone, totally healed. But it needed effort, it needed that sustained working on those other layers to lead to the physical result. So broadly, this has been an exploration of this inner dimension of the inner vital, inner mental, and to some extent the inner physical, and how they affect outer circumstances of our life, interpersonal relations, and even outcomes, and now down to the physical body and its shape and form and healing process. So this is a broad framework I have shared under the overall title of this inner powers or inner faculties which are there in us undeveloped, which we become conscious of and can develop. And there's a second part to this discussion which I will be taking up tomorrow, where I will look at how these senses also, the inner senses, can look beyond. And that will be a different line of discussion. So we can pause here and take up any comments, questions. Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts on how the butterfly transformation can be correlated with the supramental transformation?
The question is whether how the butterfly transformation can be correlated with the supramental transformation. In the butterfly, the transformation is primarily held by the life energy. The life force and some element of the mind idea which is behind the butterfly is responsible for that transformation. In itself, it is still physical substance, bound to physicality. Maybe it becomes more subtle, more light physical substance, more conscious perhaps to some degree, but that's about it. So recall in yesterday's discussion or this morning's discussion, we spoke of the transformation from life force, from mind, and then from intuition. But this is going only up to the level of the mind, that the form of the butterfly and the idea of self of butterfly has changed. In the supramental transformation, it would be a still greater power which would change the very sense of I and the very texture of the consciousness. And its particular character is of infinity. And so that will be of a far greater scope, not just of form and the consciousness associated with the form, but something even more deep. The tissue itself would become fundamentally different. And you see how in our physical biology, the tissue was plant which you have been eating, which was rock which the plant has been eating. But from this, if the tissue could become substance which is divine in its very substantiality, that is how the physical transformation by supramental consciousness would be like. The tissue itself would know its own divinity. Right now it knows its own awareness, but it would know its own divinity and would know its true relation with the divine at the level of the cells. This is somewhat far away from where we are today, but we can get a sense of what it could be like. Yes.
When the life energy acts on the seeds, does it work differently on different types of seeds?
Yes, so when the life energy acts on seeds, does it work differently on different types of seeds? If you look at the flower, the shape of the flower is a unique representation of the life energy content and even the soul content of it. And the same is true for every biological form, every species even. So there are two components there. There is the life force which has now got into a certain rhythm of the species consciousness and the species behavior which is sustaining the form. Behind that is the idea, and Sri Aurobindo uses this term real idea as distinct from mental idea. You see, the mental idea has a form, has an intention, but does not have the compelling character. It can at best influence. But if you go behind the mind to that level of consciousness, which is supra-mental, what the supra-mental conceives has not only knowledge but also power and effectivity which goes all the way down to the most material. And so there is as if a template of the divine creative consciousness which conceives of this particular animal or this particular plant. And in that is the full spread of possibilities of how that plant can develop, how that animal can develop, all the things it can do, the way it feels itself to be. And it is that which is the seed behind the species. So there's a life force which is doing its thing under guidance of this overall imprint, which guides the life force and even the consciousness behind it. Life force is still the primary driver for the instinctive forms, but this real idea behind has put the life force in a particular template of behavior. And every now and then, when the life force is unable, the instinct fails, there is an influence which comes from within. If there is an individualized soul, or from the species consciousness, or all the way back to the real idea, an influence which nudges and reshapes the patterns of life force to create new habits and new rhythms. And this is the reason why you will see animals which have contact with human beings often change in some of their instinctive patterns also. And a few generations down, they can become quite different. If horses have been bred under human contact for a few generations down, you can even develop specializations of their relationship with human beings. But all of this is included in the overarching real idea behind, which is at the supramental level. But at the vital level of life force, many modifications have taken place. Mm-hmm. Yes.
You think transformation of butterfly, the butterfly, caterpillar, butterfly, it is more than transformation, it is metamorphosis, because
Yes.
it change in the physical,
Yes.
function and energy.
The technical term is metamorphosis, which is morpho, is the field, meta of a higher, is the form, meta is of a higher level, an abstraction of form which is presiding over these two. That's the correct biological term. But in the form undergoing a radical change, in which the new form has no connection with the old form, I use the sense of transformation. You could describe it as a physical transformation of or a vital transformation, not a spiritual transformation. But yes, it's a question of vocabulary.
Because tadpole to frog is incomplete transformation.
Ah, yes. Tadpole to frog is also a pretty radical change, but not as radical as the butterfly, where literally nothing of the old is left in the transition. Yes.
So, are you familiar with the work of Bruce Lipton in epigenetics?
Whose work?
Bruce Lipton in epigenetics?
I am familiar with epigenetics, but not specifically of Bruce Lipton.
It's very much in keeping with your
Okay.
whole talk today.
Okay.
So his discoveries in genetic studies, which became epigenetics, was that the genetic code or command was not inside the cell, but in the membrane and the sensors on the outside of the cell. So in epigenetics, that the environment, or what is thought and felt, has the direct creative
Yes.
influence
Yes.
on the moment. It's just what you're saying today.
Yes. Yes. So in epigenetics, the concept is that the triggers for the genetic activations or deactivations are from the environmental influences. And here we get in a very physical level a representation of the relationship of soul and nature. It's as if the genetic structure is like a core, but its expression, the gene expression, is modifiable depending on circumstances. And of course, on a very material level, they will say it's stored in that external membrane. But I'm going a step further to say, no, it's stored in neither. It is stored in the life energy template, of which both external membrane and the genetic code are specific operations or expressions. Yes.
Yes. There is a very interesting explanation given by Sri Aurobindo. Somebody asked him, but where are these forces, vital, mental? When we look into microscope, we don't see them. You know? We see the nuclear, we see something, like even that we don't see. Yes? But he says, his answer was interesting, maybe you recall that. He says it is in the relation between the particles. In the very field, in the
Yes.
very energy, the mind of the future development is hidden there. So because of that all influence from the mind back to its own creation is very probable. Nearly scientific, there is
Yes.
nothing...
Yes. So when you observe, let's say, from a very physical perspective, and I'm not even taking now the subtle body into consideration, just at a physical level, let's say you have two particles, you have two electrons, you're sending, the example is normally given, one electron is approaching the other, and there's a repulsion, and so it is deflected. Okay? Consider, it's as if a field of energy, and we call it an electromagnetic field or an electric field, from the particle extending out at a distance, meets what? Not the other particle, but its field. So basically these are two fields meeting each other and influencing each other and modifying the position of the particle. Now go a step further. Has anyone ever seen an electron? In order to see an electron, you have to shoot at it electrons, which bounce off, and by measuring the bouncing off, you say, there's a particle there. What if there's no electron at all? There's only field. Field meeting field, which gives to you the sense of a particle which is at the center of the field. That's the reality, perhaps. And so, in a sense, you could say the vitality or the vital aspect, physical level, or the vitality in the matter of the electron is in its field, not in the particulate content itself. And maybe there is no particulate content separate from the field. And then everything, all matter, is nothing but energy fields interacting with energy fields. Particles are only the mind's conception of the source of the field. If you think about it in that way, it makes eminent sense, isn't it? Then we could go a step further. That energy field is the most dense gradation of energy. There is a refined energy, a finer gradations of energy, all the way down to the pure liberated life energy, all the way up to the pure liberated life energy, from which a burst of energy rippling down to the more dense layers can modify them. And therefore my energetic intention placed there can modify the particulate behavior or their fields, which also has been recorded in the laboratory. And maybe we'll touch upon this a little bit tomorrow. A person holds at a distance a piece of metal, concentrates upon it, and the temperature of the metal goes up. Physically nothing is exchanged because they have all those barriers in between, including barriers for electromagnetic fields. But something has gone in there, modified the life force patterns, which has modified the physical energy patterns because they're connected, which has led to this change. And the same thing taken a step further, you could take a piece of metal, concentrating on it, and the metal would bend. Because the molecular tension energy fields have softened up, and immediately the shape changes. So it's a different way of looking at it. Yes. Okay, one last question.
When there is a brain insult secondary to the intracellular hemorrhage or infarct or something, the cells are dead, right? And then you mentioned that if you infuse the energy, it can regenerate, and if the patient is a paralysis or something, it can start fighting.
Yes. So you notice in the body, suppose there's a certain shock and impact of any kind which damages, the loss of blood flow bringing oxygen begins the process of destruction of the cell. Separate from the physical injury, which may destroy a few cells but not all. It's rather the loss of energy flow which was feeding the cells which is leading to their decline. But the cells don't take very long, they don't die instantly. They take time to die. So today there's even research that says after the human body is technically dead, there are a large number of cells, including brain cells, which stay alive for a few days after the biology has shut down, basically. And this is a fact, a physical fact. So even in the brain, if there's a damage, and not all the cells die instantly, if at that point one can push in enough revitalizing life force, without the blood flow providing sufficient oxygen, the life force can provide what is needed to keep those cells sustained enough that they don't die. And this is doable. Again, one can demonstrate this in the lab. Second, there are other cells now which immediately begin to kick in to regenerate, to replace the dying cells or the dead cells. Who controls that template? Who activates those cells and teaches them to grow in a particular direction? So if there's a cut, how is it both sides of the cut know that they have to grow cells in the direction of the cut? The thing which holds the template of the healed body is in the subtle body. It is that which activates the cells. It senses, breakdown of energy flow, puts in this will, pumps in energy, starts the process, and guides the cells from both sides to eventually connect and join. So if on the template there is damage, then the joining will be ineffective, distorted. If the template is held, then the physical healing will inevitably complete rapidly, also completely. And that template is primarily in the energy, vital and mental bodies. And is a part of the vital and mental bodies that plug into the physical. And if you can protect that somehow, then you can ensure a complete healing, even if it takes a little time. And finally, and I'll end with this, in the example which I gave earlier of the tests which were done in the lab in India, the most astounding part for the scientists, which now for us will be obvious, was there was one of the healers in the United States who said, look, I would like to come, but I'm too busy. So let's do the healing over Skype call. And the scientist said, this is so outrageously crazy. But they had two laptops, one which had a Skype call with this person across the earth, the other which had a webcam projecting something, there was a control. And they put their test solutions, and there was a Skype call for whatever 10 or 15 minutes where the person concentrated and projected energy, which, we will say it came through the screen. No, it didn't come through the screen. The screen is only a link point for our mental awareness. It was energy meeting energy directly. That's how it is in the vital body, in the vital world. So distance does not matter. Okay? And it had exactly the same result as if the person was in the room, in the final outcome that they had. And so what I want to say is, in this case of the healing in the biology, let's say damaged cells healing, the goodwill which is being sent to the person by others is having as much effect as that person's own holding of the positive intention. So you can make a huge difference, and even if it's just you, if the goodwill that you pour, even at a distance, is so much greater as to overcome the negativity of the people around, or even that person's own negativity. But it has to be strong. But if everybody, all of us combine in our goodwill and positive intention and deep conviction, we can infuse something which will enormously speed up and even produce sometimes miraculous results, even sudden, rapid healings in minutes or seconds. But now the rationale of it is obvious.
How can they create the vital energy to infuse in the damaged cells and regenerate? I mean, I'm pretty sure it's happening.
Yes,
I don't know how to help.
See, the problem is right now we are unconscious in these layers of ourselves. And therefore how we act and what we act is often, as I said, misused. Just the fact that somewhere within you something says, oh my God, now she's going to suffer for the next weeks or months. You've already put out an intention. And if you're emotionally closely connected, you've just affected the person even. Not just casually, but now affected. You come and meet somebody who's sick, and somewhere inside you, in your inner parts, you're holding this, oh my God, how many more months will this continue? And on the surface you're saying, I'm really praying and hoping you'll get well, with all the good intention. But what you've actually brought is this deeper, larger part, which is having a greater impact. And that's why it's important to become conscious on these levels and to be able to act from them with full positivity. And this is part of the yoga, part of the journey of self-awakening, that we become conscious of our own totality of being and then are able to wield our action in the world more completely and more effectively. And if this is guided from the inner soul's influence or the higher spiritual influence, it is that much more effective but also true in its action. And this has to be developed. We are not doing it consciously, and it's not enough to have goodwill on the surface parts. You see? So I would like to ask you to pause briefly, just half a minute. Let's concentrate and recall the full import of this discussion, recognizing the importance that these deeper layers within us have and how effective they can be in everything in life. And let's put a conscious aspiration to align ourselves more deeply in all these parts of our being with a true inner aspiration and with the divine will, that only goodness and positive results may act from us in the world